Hey YouTube, I'm back with another Sicilian game. I want to this time look at a position where after white has played an e5 break, it is advantageous for black to capture. If you remember from our last game, we showed a position where white had played e5 and black could not capture back. So let's get through the opening. It is, of course, a Sicilian Kan because, as I mentioned before, I am looking at Sicilian Kan games, which is the my main opening against e4. And so I do play this d6, which is sort of the classical. You can play bishop c5. That's another line that people play in the Sicilian Kan. The idea is to try to shove this knight back to b3 when it won't be able to have so much influence on the king side of the board. Often the bishop, after having done its job, will drop back to e7, and sometimes d6 will be played anyway. So just playing d6 and then f4, and now b5, which is the move that I play here. Really, the idea is that black is going to try to develop a lot of pressure against e4 instead of developing his king side. So after king h1, we get to knight bd7, queen e2, and then bishop d then bishop b7, and then he develops the bishop out to d2, which makes more sense with his queen on the e file. The queen being on the e file suggests that he is going to try for an e4 plan, and then knight c5. So we can see here that black has achieved his all the pressure he can really muster against this e4 pawn. You got the knight, and the bishop, and oddly enough, this pawn is also participating in the attack on e4. In fact, already black is threatening just to play b4, and after the knight moves, he'll be able to win this e pawn. So white has to find some way of dealing with this. One pretty common way is to play a3, but the problem with a3 is it's a bit slow. And that time that black spent playing a3, the white spent playing a3, black is now just gonna castle and complete his development. He's pretty comfortable here after this little time that the white has spent. So instead of that, he could play like rook ae1, but that's really not gonna help after b4 again. He can still get into trouble. So here, white chose to play the the more direct move e5, and I suppose the idea is that the black king is still in the center, and so it should make some sense to try to open things up before black has a chance to complete his development. But here, black can safely capture. And after we get this capture back and knight d7, we can see that he has this pressure against e5 now with the queen and the knight, with only one defender, being the queen, which means that black is going to have a pretty comfortable time trying defending against any sort of direct attacks that black may come up with. So he plays here rook ae1, and then another really common idea is the knight takes on d3. However, instead, he could have chose to play something more straightforward, like play bishop e7, and even then, it's going to be okay for black. So if black tries to go all out for an attack, he can just play g6, and then if queen h6, which prevents castling, he can just go the other way, which is another interesting idea. Of course, white can't take here on f7 because of knight takes e5, and this isn't going to be good because of this knight hanging here. So black is quite happy if he finds himself in this situation. Instead, black chooses another idea. He plays knight takes d3, which again, as we mentioned before, is a really common way of dealing with the bishop now being open after e5 having been played. And of course, white's forced to take back with the a pawn. And now we get the new idea, bishop c6, bishop c5. Instead of going to e7, he's going to come out to c5 with tempo. White can try to keep some pieces on the board, but after just castle, he's gonna be okay. He's still got the pressure here. This knight on f3 actually sort of blocks the rook from attacking down the f file and blocks the queen from coming out to like h5 or something like that. And these two bishops pointed at White's king might suggest that he's going to have some problems there if he tries to get too crazy. Also, this pawn on d3 is backwards, and so there could be some play against that as well. So, with these things in mind, the pressure here, the backwards pawn here, and the bishops really bearing down on the black king, White's going to have a hard time generating a really strong attack. So, going back, black chose to black chose to just play. Oops, not that. He played queen g4, and this allowed him to play bishop takes d4. Of course, he's not going to take here on g7 because that would just leave black up a piece, and so we get queen takes d4 and now castle. And the black position is quite solid now. He's managed to trade 2 sets of minor pieces, which have to help him in terms of trying to survive an attack. And he still does have this backwards pawn and this pressure on e5. White chose rook c1, trying to use some of this pressure on the c file, along with the fact that the queen does need to still protect the knight. However, he could try for maybe a straightforward kingside attack. So a couple ideas that I looked at was like rook f4, just trying to lift a rook and come across, which is pretty typical. Notice the f3 square not available because of this bishop. And so if something like this, black could just respond by bringing his rook into the center. He's threatening to discover against the queen if something were to happen there. So we get queen e3. He still needs to stay in touch with this pawn. And rook f e8 now. And then if rook g4, perhaps threatening to come in with the queen to h6 or to g5, he can just play f5 now, which is going to let the queen is now going to defend g7. And of course, if black takes, we can retake with the knight here. And we're pretty comfortable. Rook g3 getting out of the pin, and now e5. And already the plan is to play knight h5 and then knight f4, which is going to put some pressure on this d3 pawn. So if black tries to stop that, we can just get king h8, and it's pretty difficult to find any additional way of adding more pieces to this attack. If he tries to bring the knight in, we'll just swap it. And he has to be a little bit careful because he has potential some back rank issues, and there's going to be an attack here on d3 as well. So if instead of playing rook f4, another shot at an attack that he may have, I looked at was playing just queen g4 directly, which doesn't actually give up this pawn because of bishop h6. So black would just play king h8 to get out of that problem. And now if d4, trying to cover this pawn so he can lift this rook in, we just play queen c4, which threatens again to capture here or create some other issues. So excuse me. So if rook f4, trying to prevent the capture there, we get like queen d3, and the queen has circled around the pawns, and now is going to be able to help defend from the front if need be. Hitting the bishop, of course, so bishop c1, and then just rook a c8, which is going to create some additional problems of trying to get this knight involved, because there could be some problems with the bishop there. So rook fe1, trying to continuing to try to come up with this direct attack, but now b4, kicking that knight, and again f5 is going to close down the pressure. This time capturing again with the knight, and the queen can't take on e6, of course, because the rook could come across, and we would be dropping a piece there. So again, if black tries some rather direct attacks, uh, black is going to be able to hold against those. Again, remembering that key f5 defensive maneuver that we talked about before. I mean, often f5 is used to stop white from playing f5, or it's used to set up to stop this bishop from coming out. But often it can just be gaining some space on the king side, controlling this g4 square, and then often letting a major piece come across to defend from the 7th rank. And then, of course, if capturing, then the knight gets the f6 square back. So f5, again, kind of a star player in the black's repertoire here. So with perhaps seeing that these ideas weren't going to be the most successful, black chose to play, or excuse me, not black, white chose to play, instead of either of these, he chose rook c1. And black goes ahead and grabs the pawn. It turns out he's not going to be able to hold on to this pawn. But after the knight here with the discover, he brings this knight back, and then queen d6. And black does have some pressure that he needs to deal with. He opts to bring the rook in, and then after queen trade, he has a little bit of a problem with this hanging rook here. We get bishop f4, and he's forced to play e5, giving the pawn back. And the reason for that is, if he tries to just play rook d7, excuse me, tries to just play rook d7, then we get knight c5, and we can't hold on to this bishop at the same time as avoid losing the rook here. If he tries to play here, just taking and taking. Well, I guess he can't do them in a row, but you see the idea. So the sort of the tricky move that he comes up with, instead of playing rook d7 immediately, he plays excuse me, he plays e5, and now after bishop takes and rook d7, after this he can now come up here, and this is hitting with tempo. So if he captures here, we're just going to capture back here. Or, no, sorry, not with the rook. We're going to take with the knight, of course, if he captures here. But he chooses not to do that. He plays bishop f4, wanting to keep his bishop. And then we get to bishop a8, also wanting to keep his bishop. Gives up this pawn, but that's short-lived, because he gets this one in return. And it's clear that black has survived any attack that might have been pending after this f-file was opened up. He has a slightly better endgame, I think perhaps due to his somewhat better pawn structure, although now it looks really pretty equal. I think it would be difficult to imagine that this game ended in anything but a draw, but black does manage to pull out a win, and he does it by advancing his kingside majority, and he ends up creating some problems on the g2 square, given that he still has a light squared bishop. I don't think that this was a necessary result, but after a fairly lengthy endgame, we get some more trade of the pawns here. The rook comes in, we trade the knights, and here I think white really doesn't know exactly what he's trying to do. He's just kind of moving pieces around, and for that matter, so is black. So we'll go through this fairly quickly. And you see that black is just going to start advancing his king side. And he's clearly the one trying to play for a win here, because there's several occasions where he chooses to not allow the trade of pieces when he has the opportunity to do so. So just kind of fakes at bringing his king up and then changes his mind. Again, advancing the pawns. And after this trade of rooks, here I think it's clear that he's decided that he's going to try to play for a win, because it's almost an instant draw if you trade rooks here. Instead, he brings the bishop back to block that, and continues to bring his king and pawns up here. And still everything's more or less okay. But after white remains a little bit careless here, especially this a3, he allows g3, and now king g1. And after king g4, black is going to start to get some mating threats, which are going to cause him a lot of problems. So here, black played rook a7, not seeing what black's idea was here. So he plays rook d7, which threatens mate, and is going to drive the king to f1. The other defense, trying to play rook a1, just fails to rook d2, and he's going to drop this pawn on g2. So instead, he plays rook f1, but then we get a bit of a shocker. He plays bishop takes g2. So we take here, and he takes, and he's going to be able to. Of course, he can't go back to h1 because it's just mate. So this is his only move. And after h3, he resigned because there's just no stopping him from getting this queen here. The best he could do would be to take here. We get a queen. We come out with a couple checks, and black's just going to make another queen. So clearly a loss here. But I think going back to the situation right after e5 was played, I think the key thing to look at here is that we're able to capture and then have immediate pressure on e5, which is couple that without, he doesn't have a weakness on the dark squares yet, like we did in the other game that he looked at. The other game, the pawn was on g6, and he'd already castled, and there was a rook here on f8, which meant that after bishop h6, he could drive that rook away, which was going to cause problems on f7. Here, if white tries to get too froggy, as we saw, black can actually just castle the other way. So not having castled yet, I think actually perhaps makes this decision on whether or not he should take on e5 a bit easier, because he has more options on how to deal with a possible kingside attack. So again, he brought this in, and then we followed up with this next capture on d3. And again, we saw against the straightforward kingside attacks, he was able to develop and then play this f5 move, and was able to hold against any of those attacks. Anyway, I hope that this was educational, instructive for you guys, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.